Greetings, friends! Juan Ingruski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of February 3rd through February 9th of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, and share this video around. Alrighty, this week is the week of the Ukrainians strike back. Well, not really hard, but they do strike back. There's a lot of counterattacks that the Ukrainians are doing. My assumption of this is that they think that there's going to be some negotiations that are having, and they're trying to improve their position somewhat by saying, hey, we actually could still fight back, that give us better peace terms. That is my read on the situation. And the biggest thing, counterattack that happened, is in the Kursk direction, which is actually where we're going to be talking about this week. Now, with that being said, the Russians have also made some advances, so it is kind of like, but this is, we haven't seen the Ukrainians gain a lot of things recently, so it's pretty interesting how they're counterattacking almost along the entire front. But the biggest thing where they had the biggest push was in the south of Suchka. One of the biggest things is that the Ukrainians basically broke through from their position in Suchka and tried to break into the Russian defenses in the villages that are south of Suchka on the northern side of the Pestel River. The main thing is that they were going along two roads. They were going along this road in particular, and they actually disembarked mostly around this kind of little lake here. And then they also took some positions up in this tree line here, and they also entered the village of Fantasia here. And now the other thing is they were also trying to attack the village of Cherkaska Konopolka. Now at the height of it is that it seemed like the Ukrainians took these two villages and everything to the north, not everything, but a lot of things to the north of the Pestel River here, and they were on the outskirts of the village of Ulanok and Ruska Konopolka. However, at the end of this week, it seems like after their first 1 or 2 day successes, they started getting pushed back, and now the Russians are back into the village of Cherkaska Konopolka, and it looks like now there's battles going on for this village still, and so now they're being squeezed in, and it doesn't look like the Ukrainians are going to be able to expand their gains here. But there was a counterattack here. Now, you might be wondering, well, what was the purpose of this? Like, okay, let's say they do hold on to these two villages. What was the purpose? The purpose is that the Ukrainians want to hold the village of Sushka as much as possible. It was the biggest gain they got from the Kursk adventure, and it's the biggest prize. As you can see, it's a pretty decent-sized town, and the Ukrainians want to hold this as a bargaining chip, the whole Kursk thing in general, but Sushka is one of the biggest prizes, and the Russians, are we talking about, the Russians actually entered the southern part of Sushka in the village of Bakhnotovka here, and now there's also proof that the village of Bakhnotovka has been recaptured by the Ukrainians, so the Russian push into the southern part of Sushka was repulsed, but it was because the Russians were getting so close to the southern part of Suchka that they had to do a counterattack to try to push the Russians back. So now the Russians are having to restart their progress here and try to recapture these villages and before they could get back into Suchka. So the Ukrainians actually lost a ton of vehicles. A ton of vehicles were wiped out in the pursuit of trying to take back in these villages. There was a lot of FPV drone attacks. This was a very strong armored attack. And a lot of vehicles were destroyed. The Ukrainians did gain these two villages, but now the progress has stopped. Now they're being rolled back. So it's very interesting to see how that rolls out here. Now, but the whole reason for this was to protect Suchka for negotiation purposes. So yeah, that was one of the main areas of the Ukrainian counterattacks. The Ukrainians are trying to hold their position in Suchka as much as possible. This is actually why they're trying to hold up in Malonovka a lot. The reason for this is because they don't want the Russians to be bearing down on the northern part of Suchka. Now, in the more western side of Suchka, the Russians are actually making the counterattacks, and this week the Russians are apparently battling for the village of Serodolokovka. Now, this map doesn't update it, but most sources say, at least pro-Russian sources, say that the Russians actually have positions in Serodolokovka, and especially have positions in these fields to the north of the international border here. I always find it kind of interesting about how these operations work. Where do they what's the positions here? Is there a river here or some shit that allows them to defend themselves, or what's the there's no natural defense here. I would think that marching along these fields here would expose you to counterattacks here. Though on the other side, right, it's where will the Ukrainians hold positions here? They'll have to go all the way back in these forests to launch a counterattack here. But so it's kind of hard to hold Serodolokovka, but apparently that's what the Russians are doing. They're pushing along their fields from Darno and Nitsikilian, and they are slowly but surely trying to reach take the village of Serodolokovka. This also, because if they could take it, then they'll start getting closer and closer to cutting the main supply route to Sushka. So my guess is the Ukrainians are going to try to do a counterattack here as well. So the main thing is that the Russians are collapsing onto Sushka, and the more they do that, the more likely they are to and the Ukrainians are going to try to stop them from doing that. So the Russians are trying to battle for settle Dukovko. The Ukrainians are pushing Russians out of southern Sushka. So back and forth here, but the Kursk region is flaring up here. So, and this also shows the Ukrainians still have a lot of material in the Kursk area to help secure their gain here. Alrighty. Besides Kursk, another area, which is actually a more familiar area that we've been talking about recently, that where the Ukrainians are also doing some counterattacks, is in the Pokrovsk direction. Let's talk about Pokrovsk. Now, the Russians have basically, in their attempts to encircle Pokrovsk from the west, have slowed down. And the reason for this is because the Ukrainians are on counterattack, and this week, not only are they in the last 2 weeks or so, the Ukrainians weren't necessarily on the counterattack; they were throwing a bunch of reserves in, which forced the Russians to try to, have to continuously grind them up. But it took so long that it paused all advances here. So the Russians reached Dachne and Kotelny, but now they are, but they weren't able to advance further than that. But now the Ukrainians are counterattacking. The biggest counterattack is happening in the village of Pashana. So the Russians took the villages of Pashana and Shenandokovko here. These were two very strong defensive points that allowed the Russians to actually advance towards Kotlin and Dachne. And the Ukrainians, using their positions in Pokrovsk, actually did a counterattack here and reached the industrial base of Pashana. So the Ukrainians tried to enter this industrial zone. And a lot of sources say, we have geolocated footage of the Russians droning Ukrainians here. So, but the question is like, where exactly are the Russian? Like, a lot of Russian sources are saying they actually kicked the Ukrainians out and they're back in Zernovo. Well, where have the Russians actually recaptured this industrial plant? We don't know yet. But we do know that the Ukrainians have counterattacked it and they're trying to retake Pashana, because if they could take Pashana, that actually unhinges a lot of the defenses here. The Russians were using Pashana, Shenandokovko, their positions in Dachitska, Zelania as like a kind of like holding the line here as they march towards here. But if the Ukrainians are I'm expecting there's probably going to be another counterattack in Shenandokovko here. The Ukrainians will try to do another counterattack. Try to maybe enter this town. And because if they could take these two towns back, then this really unhinges the Russian push towards the western part of Pokrovsk. But so the Ukrainians are actually doing counterattacks. They're also counterattacking Kotlin now. Some sources are saying the Ukrainians are actually trying to enter the southern part of Kotlin here. So there's battles going on here. And so, lots of back and forths here. Now, there's not as much consolidation, so it's not like they actually control this industrial zone or they control the southern part of Kotlin yet. I'm just mentioning that they did counterattacks here, and now it's just a question of, well, how much more have they advanced in this area? So, the Russians are trying to hold on to Pashana to Kotlin as the Ukrainians are doing their counterattacks. Now, these aren't as successful as the Ukrainian counterattack in Kursk was, but it does show that the Ukrainians are trying to really put the pressure on the Russians here. So yeah, that is what's happening there. And also, the Russians are pushing in Udashna still, but they have slowed down. They still have positions right on the eastern outskirts. There's a presence in Udashna, but most of the village is still under Ukrainian control. But the battle for Udashna is still ongoing. So that's where the Ukrainians are counterattacking. But since we're in the Pokrovsk direction, let's also talk about where the Russians are also advancing, which is in this area in between the South Donetsk and Pokrovsk directions. So this week, the Russians are also still battling in Uspenivka. We actually have more geolocated footage of the Russians being in the center of Uspenivka, especially in this area. But some pro-Russian sources are saying that the Russians have completely captured the village of Uspenivka, which is like, wow, holy shit, this took such a long time that I'm surprised it's still... I don't know why it took so long for them to take Uspenivka. But anyway, Uspenivka has finally fallen to the Russians. We're actually starting, this is like kind of what we saw, last year, or in the beginning of this year, where every village took maybe a week or, it didn't even take 1, 2, or 3. It took like a month for Uspenivka to be taken. So this was a very hard-fought village. This is a stepping stone towards, them, moving along the Solona River towards the Dnipro Oblast. But, so pro-Russian sources saying Uspenivka has fallen. Objective control shows that they only captured the center part of the town. The Ukrainians could still be in the western part of Uspenivka, so we don't know 100%, but it looks like Uspenivka has fallen, at least according to pro-Russian sources. but at the very least, the Russians have continuously improved their gains in Uspenivka. More in the south here, the Russians have completely captured the village of Srebrenica. This is a very solid game for the Russians this week. This has a lot of high-rise buildings here. As you can see, there's a education building, there's a hospital. There's some like good positions that Russians could use in Srebrenica to continue their advance here. So they have completely captured the village of Srebrenica by countering it from multiple angles here. And now they are entering the village of Zaporozhye here. And some sources are saying that the eastern part of the town has been captured by the Russians here. And so, the Russians will probably continue moving along the street and try to capture it. The hardest part, though, is that if they do capture Zaporozhye, the Ukrainians still have positions in the fields to the south here and to the fields to the north here. So the Russians, will have to probably try to capture these fields to the south here and try to at least secure the flanks of their positions in Zaporozhye. But yeah, the Russians are now battling for Zaporozhye. They're, step by step, Srebrenica has fallen, but step by step, they're now marching closer and closer to the Dnipro Oblast. The village of Nadivka is still a lot. I think it's been captured, but we don't have geolocated footage 100% yet. So we're still waiting to see if the Russians still have positions here or if this village is still being fought over. Alrighty, that is the Kursk direction. Now that we're in the same general direction, let's talk about the South Donetsk direction. This is one of the first videos in a while where I did not start in the South Donetsk direction. But let us talk about it. Now, in this area, there's actually been this is where the Russians are making a lot of progress. And in this area, the main thing is that the Dachne pocket is rapidly collapsing. Well, at least not rapidly, but collapsing. The main thing, one of the biggest gains of this week, is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Dachne. This is one of the main areas the Ukrainians were using to hold their positions here. We actually have geolocated footage of the Russians raising their flags here. So I have no clue why the Ukrainians decided to hold on to Dachne. Most are saying they have retreated. There's a fortification right between Dachne and Ulakli, and then Ulakli itself. So they fell back to Ulakli, but I still don't know why they were holding on to Dachne for so long, especially when the Russians were all the way already in Andriivka and all that. But anyway, maybe it was a delaying action. But in any case, the Russians have completely captured the village of Dachne and have captured this village, and the Ukrainians have fell back to Ulakli. So before that, they kind of broke through in the north here and the south, and the Ukrainians were kind of holding up to these buildings in the west, but they finally fell as well. So the village of Dachne has been captured by the Russians, but more importantly, besides the fall of Dachne, is what the Russians have been achieving in the Battle for Andriivka. So last week, where we left off, is that the Russians were on the eastern outskirts of Andriivka. They entered the village, but they did not really have any good positions in it. This week, the Russians have broken through into central Andriivka. Most mappers have said that the center part of the village is being fought over. This is where most of the high-rise buildings are. This is where probably where the post office is. They say there's a castle here. This looks like a roundabout, more like Litbo. This looks like a church. But anyway, this is where more of the high-rise building area. So this is, besides the little houses that make up little things, there's very little that can be said about what's going on in Andriivka here. But besides the center, so the center is being fought over. The Russians broke through into the center of Andriivka. But the most important about battling for the center is that it actually cuts off the main highway that connects the village of Constantinople with Andriivka. So the Ukrainians were kind of supplying both these positions. Now, I'm pretty certain there's probably pontoon bridges they could build over this area here, but this actually had a natural road and shit. So, that doesn't mean that Constantinople is cut off. And even if they can't build pontoon bridges, they still have a highway that connects them to Baratar, and then they could cross this area here. So but the continuous defense between Andriivka and Constantinople has been cut. And I wouldn't actually be surprised if the Russians actually take Andriivka by the end of next week. So the Russians, will take Andriivka, and then from that point, they can actually then start crossing the river in Constantinople, and they could try to push from here into that and collapse the entire pocket of Ulakli and Constantinople. The main purpose here is, and I think this is gonna, once they do this, they're gonna stop, but they're trying to basically push the Ukrainians as far away from Krakow as possible. But the main goal here is to try to take Andriivka, Constantinople, and Rozdavlo, and then collapse this entire pocket. This will flatten the front here, and if you kind of scroll out here, the Russians will have a continuous front line around from Velika Novosovka to here. So you can see this makes actually the front line flat, and then they'll be able to hold on to here as the Russians keep pushing to the west here. So, but I think after that point the Russians will stop. I don't think they'll continue pushing towards Baratar and stuff like that. Just like after they completely captured Velika Nosovka, the Russians paused here. But anyway, so the capture of central Andreevka is very good news for the Russians. Konstantinopol and Andreevka were holding on to this Dachne pocket, and it's the Russians have broken through here. So, I wouldn't be surprised if Andreevka get captured next week, and with that, we could basically say goodbye to these few villages that are here. And now that I'm here, let's talk about Zaporozhye just very quickly. This is also another place where the Ukrainians are counterattacking. Apparently, the Ukrainians are counterattacking in Kamyanska. We talked about this a month or two ago, but the Ukrainians are still battling for the southern part of Kamyanska. Before, the village was split in half by this kind of river here, but the Ukrainians crossed this river and are actually battling for positions in the southern part. The Russians still have positions in the southern part of Kamyanska, but the Ukrainians are actually doing counterattacks here to hold on to push the Russians completely out of Kamyanska itself here. So we shall see how if Russians could hold on to their positions in Kamyanska, but that is just something to mention in the Zaporozhye direction. Alrighty. Now let us talk about the Terets direction. This is an area where the Russians are pushing. And the interesting thing about Teretsk is that this week is actually officially where the Russian Ministry of Defense has announced that the Russians have completely captured the village of Terets. So that means that we don't have any flag raised. We didn't see any flags being raised in like the northern part of this mining district, for example. But the announcing that the complete liberation of this settlement by the Russians MOD basically implies that this was finally captured. So now we could say Terets has fallen, but again, it's I kind of called it like 2 weeks early, but it looks like now officially the battle for this mining shaft is over, if the Ministry of Defense is to be believed. And right now the main focus, and they also announced the complete capture of Druzhba, so it looks like the Ukrainians were kind of trying to hold on to some positions in like the outskirts here, but it looks like the Russians were able to push them out back towards the other Dachne in the Donetsk Oblast here. My theory is the Russians will probably try to advance along this rail line and try to capture Dachne, maybe these tree lines here, and this will allow them to capture a lot of these areas around the mine shaft as well, just to secure their positions in Terets a bit better. But also where the Russians are also battling for is Shirobrinka and Novospatsky. We don't have any major changes in this area, but this is also where the Russians are pushing. But yeah, Terets has been officially liberated, but the battles are still ongoing here. Another area in this area where the Russians are pushing is in the village of Yedodivka here, this area right here. There's a bunch of back and forth here. The Russians don't have control of this village just yet, but it is but this is where the main battles are going on for this village. So the Russians are in these fields to the how would you say it, southwest of Vorzhenka, but the Ukrainians are also in Malonivka in these fields, so they're able to bring troops to bear for this area. So and since it's such a small village, if you try to establish yourself here, it'll just be bombed and everything. Anyway, so this is where the main battle is going on for the Terets in this kind of more Minigrad area. But yeah, besides that, there's not been anything else in the Terets, just the official liberation of this town, but battles are still ongoing. Alrighty, let's now move on somewhere else. Let's go to the Le Mans direction. There's actually been no changes in the Chasiv Yar and Seversk direction. Very surprising for Chasiv Yar. And so, yeah, so no changes in Chasiv Yar or Seversk direction. Even though Chasiv Yar is like one of the biggest battles going on, there's actually been no changes this week, so that's very interesting. Alrighty, let us now go to the Le Mans direction. And this is actually where the Russians actually have made some progress here as well. The main thing is that the Russians are battling for the village of Yampolovka. This makes sense as the Russians push in the south here. It looks like they reached the small village of Bilogorovka in the south here. And from here, it looks like the Russians are basically trying to take Yampolovka and Mirnya. This will allow them maybe to encircle one of the main goals, which is the village of Kolodozovska here. Instead of attacking it directly, maybe they're trying to take the positions here, so then they get attacked from the south and directly, and then maybe try to outflank it and then capture it. So, maybe trying to encircle a bit better. So, in order to do that, they need to take the village of Yampolovka. And this week, we actually have some really good confirmation that the Russians are in the northern part of Yampolovka and have captured the northern part of this village. So, the battle for Yampolovka is ongoing. We shall see if it takes as long as Terny. Hopefully for the Russians, it does not. But yeah, the battle for Yampolovka has begun after about a few weeks hiatus after capture Terny, because the Russians were focusing on their bridgehead here. But yeah, so the Russians have entered Yampolovka. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Actually, speaking of the Chasiv Yar direction, I actually now that I think about it, there was actually one report that I think I should mention here is that the Russians, according to the Russian MOD, they have completely captured the village of Oreko Vasilivka. So that is interesting. We don't have any like flag raising, so something like this. I'm waiting for more confirmation. I don't know 100% of this is a right call by the Ministry of Defense, but that is something that I should be mentioning here. What's interesting here is that I've always thought that they should control Oreka Vasilivka and Grigorivka, just to secure the northern part of their advance in Chasiv Yar. I always thought that using the Sovietsky Donbass Canal, they could capture Oreka Vasilivka and then and Grigorivka and just kind of hold their positions along the canal like this, and that way they could actually then capture this quarry, and then have the front line be something like this, which will I think help the Russians a lot in northern Chasiv Yar. But I guess it doesn't really matter anymore because the Russians already captured basically northern Chasiv Yar. But it is interesting, something to mention about Oreka Vasilivka, that it has been captured, or at least according that reports are coming in about it. We don't know 100% yet, but that is something I want to mention that I forgot. Alrighty, now let us go to the Kupiansk direction, and this is actually where both the Russians have. This is where the most interesting thing for the Russians are happening, and this is also where there's also another small Ukrainian counterattack. In this area, the Russians. Let's talk about where the Ukrainians are counterattacking, and this is more in the southern Kupiansk direction. According to most mappers, the Ukrainians are doing a counterattack in the village of Zarosozhovko here, and apparently now this village is now being contested. Before the Russians captured this village, but now it is being contested. The same thing happened in Kosolenivka. So basically what we could say here is the Russians have complete control of the village of Krulatovka, and then in the village in the north of Kosolenivka and Zarozovsko, both the Russians and Ukrainians have dual control, meaning they're still being fought over. But the Ukrainians are on the offensive here, trying to push the Russians out of Zarozovsko. It'd be a very big gain for the Ukrainians, if they could actually destroy this Russian attack here, because this split the Oskil defenses in half between Kupiansk and Liman and Borova, and so if they could take Krulatovka, it'd be a very big gain for the Ukrainians. But so the Russians really need to hold on to this as much as possible. But the Ukrainians, we talked about like a month ago where they tried to advance to Klesonovko and managed to capture a chunk of this village. I think the Russians still have positions in the southern part of this village, and then Zarozozo. It looks like the Russians still have positions in the north, but the Ukrainians have captured like the center and south, at least according to the mappers. So the Ukrainians are trying to squeeze into this. This is a very, if you scroll out, you can definitely see this is like a bit of a protrusion. So the Ukrainians have positions in Kupiansk and then in Borova, and then they could try to squeeze it on multiple angles. This is why the Russian push here is very, they paused this push here like a couple weeks ago, but this is why the Russians had to push towards Lozova, towards Zelensky Hall, is because the more they could push here, then they could actually stop making this a bit of a protrusion and more of a how do you say it? Like an actual front line where their flanks are more secure. So yeah, the Ukrainians are trying to squeeze out this Russian position in Krulatovka, but the Russians are holding on. Where the Russians are actually making a lot of progress, though, is in this Kupiansk Dorichia bridgehead here, and we actually have a lot of interesting gains this week for this area. So last week we talked about how the Russians have completely captured the village of Dorichnia, or the town, because it's actually this is not just a village, this is actually pretty big town. I think it had like 4,000 people pre-war, so pretty strong area to hold on for a bridgehead. And we talked about how the Russians now expanded their positions in the north and took the village of Novomolinsk. Did I mention that last week? I forgot. Like, was that a thing that happened 2 weeks ago or a week ago? Forgot. But anyway, they took Novomolinsk. But this week they actually had a very big expansion of this bridgehead to the north here. And actually, they have captured the village of Fetukvoka here, moving along the river here. It's actually very interesting. We actually have geolocated footage of that as well. It wasn't even just like a map update. It was actually a change in the we actually had geolocated footage of the Ukrainians droning Russian positions here. So this was actually a major push. So before we thought like maybe the Russians just took Novomolinsk and some positions here, but it looks like they actually broke through here and not only that, they actually captured this area right here as well. So they have a road that connects them from Dorichnia to Fetivka, so that could help them a lot. The Russians will probably try to capture this tree line here just to defend their positions between Novomolinsky and Filiptiko from the north. And they'll also probably continue pushing positions here, try to take the hills, try to take these two hills to the north of Dachne and to the west of Filiptiko as well. So they'll try to expand their positions in the northern part of here as well, but capturing this village is a very good first step here. So that was a very big gain for the Russians here. The Russians are also expanding from their positions in Zaptida. We have some geolocated footage that the Russians actually have captured not only the road, the highway between Zaptida and Dachne, which will simplify the logistics between this area. So from the looks of it, the Russians are going to use Dachne as their main position for supply, and then they use the roads here, this road leading to Filiptiko and this road to Zaptida, as like the expansion. So from Zaptida, the main place where the Russians want to push towards is the village of Manolonivka here. This is where the main place the Russians are going to try to push for. But in the meantime, the Russians will always try to push towards the village of Dorshevivka, which is the doorway to this village. To do that, the Russians actually have expanded not only along this road. Some sources saying they actually have captured these tree lines to the north of Zaptida, and have also captured the tree lines to the west of Zaptida. So they're actually expanding in a lot of areas around this village. This is also this is smaller than Dachne, obviously, but it's actually a pretty interesting village that they use to hold on their troops, to put their troops in, and then expand in every direction. So the Russians are actually making a lot of progress in this like Dachne bridgehead here. I think I talked about this last week about there's two. I think the main goal here is to try to encircle Kupiansk from the north. So I think that's where the Russians will be focusing on. But there's also another area where the Russians could actually make their big push here, which is towards the Sovietsky Donets River. This will allow them to kind of have this be the natural defense, because if they could push along here and take everything here, then everyone's positions in this area will be completely cut off, and then they can move along this river using the river as a natural defense, and then collapse this entire front line. So then the front line will look something like this, which will be very good for the Russians. This will take a huge chunk of Kharkov for them. But yeah, so the Dachne bridgehead is expanding very solidly for the Russians, and I am excited to see where this expands towards. Alrighty, so that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates. Be sure to like this video, comment your thoughts, and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.